Okay, so my father was a young poet and playwright back in the 1930s, and he wrote a lot of poetry detailing, what was going on back then during the Depression years. Many of the same problems that we're faced with today. He wrote a book of these poems, and I mean, like, every one of them is still relevant. His name, Eugene Victor Etler, named after Eugene Victor Debs.
Wow.
And so this poem is about an artist's protest that was held in New York in 1936. So we're talking about 75 or more years ago, when my father was a young man in his 20s. It's entitled Artist's Protest, and I'll read a preamble that I wrote, which goes like this. The poem below is a dramatic recreation of an incident in which WPA artists protested the dismissal of nearly 2,000 of their ranks from WPA projects in New York City. As we enter into a new era in which a progressive social agenda has once again come to the fore, we must remember that the victories were won during the New Deal, the spread of industrial unionism, the establishment of Social Security, and later during the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movements, women's and anti-war movements came about because people fought in the streets and the halls of justice, forcing their elected officials to respond accordingly. There's a contemporary newspaper account. The incident that the poem is based on was reported on in the New York Times. I was able to get an archive of that, and I have a PDF which I have online, which can be printed out. So the poem is as follows. It's entitled Artist's Protest. There we were, more than 400 of us, waiting to be received so we could lay down our demands. We should have known that they wouldn't see us. Well, we kind of expected it. So we made up our minds to stay until we would be seen. That was about 4 in the afternoon. We made up our minds to stay the night through, and the next day too, we made up our minds to stay until we would be seen. And somebody, some big shot or other, he stood on the table and looked down at us, and I felt like spitting in his eye, for he looked down at us with a sneer in his eye, and when he spoke, I felt like taking his neck in my hands and stopping the words that seemed to push their way out of his neck. For the words that he spoke to us who are trying to keep our jobs, fighting to keep our jobs so we could keep ourselves from falling into the dung heap of the jobless march, the words that he spoke, why don't you go home? Nobody's going to see you. So it ain't going to do you no good to hang around. Go on home like good little boys and girls. And if you don't, I'm warning you that if you're not out of here in an hour or two, I'm going to call the cops. And the word cops went stumbling through the crowd, and somebody from the crowd yelled out, "Oh yeah, oh well, policemen are sissies." And we all laughed, and the man on the table, he turned all green and white and his lips closed tight, seeing that we were prepared to fight for our jobs, our lousy jobs, our $23.86 jobs, and the minutes went by and we linked our arms together into a human chain. There, the 400 of us, women and men, chained together in one united thought. Together we'll fight for our jobs, to keep our jobs. And the minutes went by, and as the minutes went by, we began to chant a song of demand which seemed to toss sand upon the wounds of the man that stood on the table, for suddenly he cried out, "I warned you, I did." And we yelled back, "Why don't they see us? We'll stay and only leave when all pink slips are rescinded. That we demand." And so there we stood as the minutes crept by, armed together by a common thought that we'd stand together, for we knew that through unity, and only through unity, could we make administrators, people, a city, a nation, a world, see that we mean to keep our jobs because we need our jobs, to keep us from falling into the dung heap of the jobless march. So closely knit together we stood, 400 stood, perched upon the 8th floor of a building that stood a challenge to our jobs. And then from below we heard the eerie song of sirens singing a song of police coming their way. And we knew the time had come when we 400 were to show our militancy to an unsuspecting world. We'll stick together, we quoted to ourselves. We won't leave, we shouted to ourselves. Policemen are sissies, we comforted ourselves. Let them come, we defied them to ourselves. We shall not be moved, we challenged ourselves. And they came, streaming into that room, blue coats streaming into that room, and they looked at them as one would look at an enemy, and we tightened our grips amongst ourselves, strengthening a human chain made up of emotions far stronger than fists or clubs. And the mouth of a blue coat opened, and it tossed out words, and it tossed words out at us. Why don't yous go home, it said. Why don't yous be nice, it said. Yous were just making trouble, it said. Go on home, it said. And one of us in reply yelled, we ain't. And that summed it up in a nutshell. Don't yous know you're breaking the law? The mouth of the blue coat opened and closed. The WPA only rented this space from 9 to 6. And you're staying here after 6 when you're supposed to leave. Only make is breaking the law. Opened and closed the mouth of the blue coat. We're not going to leave. We're not going to leave until pink slips are rescinded. And above our chanting, we heard a whistle. And we felt the warmth of blue coats surging toward us. We linked our arms closer, tighter together, welding ourselves solidified into a forbearing human chain. And then they tried to pull us one by one out of that chain, and we wouldn't be moved. We'll show them our strength, not the strength of brutality, but the strength of unity. We won't be moved. They talk of Spain and the terror of fascism. They condemn a Hitler and act shocked at the playful games of a Mussolini plays with the rights of a people. And they tell us, American citizens, that we should be proud and glad that we live in such a democracy, and America, the land of the free. Well, those who talk, if they were but eyewitnesses to the goings-on the 8th floor in a room surrounded by 4 walls and 1 door, a room enclosing 400 souls brutally attacked by New York's finest, for clubs were being wielded and fists were being used, and men were throwing curses to the steady drip of workers' blood, and women were screeching defiance to the steady beat of Cossacks' clubs. Oh yes, blood washed the floor, blood of workers, blood washed the floor, cleansing it of the trampled prints the police left, and the cries of the men and women which re-echoed against the walls remained to haunt those who had no desire to see men and women who demanded jobs, those men and women who remained to meet the clubs of the law as the clubs of the law amid the bones of the people fighting for jobs. And the curses of the cops intermingled with the defiant cries of workers spelt the doom of American democracy, for the smell of fascism stank its way through that room, and the forceful clubs beat a wooden tattoo upon the skulls and bones of innocent workers. The room that we entered was no more the same, for desks were overturned, typewriters battered to a pulp, papers strewn red by workers' blood, as triumphantly cops dragged us out and down the elevators into the yawning mouths of Black Mariahs. Triumphantly cops marched us out. The brave bluecoats of New York's finest, they fought us with fists and clubs while we fought together, wielded together into a human train. No, we were not defeated. We have just begun to fight. So tossed into wagons to be driven to stations, battered and slaughtered by the fists and clubs of brutality, we struck a new note for freedom, and together we sang America, as deep in our hearts we knew that the words betrayed us.